Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on web browser extensions, what they are, the security risks they pose, and how organizations can protect themselves. I'm Alon Levine. I'm the VP of Product Management at Seraphic Security, and I'll be host of moderator of this session. At Seraphic, we focus on securing enterprise browsers without disrupting productivity. One key area of concern for organizations today is browser extensions. While they enhance functionality, they can still also introduce a lot of potential risks for privacy risks. That is exactly what we're going to discuss today. To guide us through this topic, we have a fantastic guest speaker, Matt Frisbie, a Google developer expert with deep expertise in browser extensions. Before diving into his insights, I'd like to give him a chance to introduce himself. Matt, great to have you here. Why don't you start by
Thank you,
sharing
Alon.
about your background before we jump into discussion?
Yeah, thank you, Alon, and thank you to Seraphic for having me on to talk about this very important subject. Hi, everyone. My name is Matt Frisbie. I am the author of Building Browser Extensions and some other JavaScript titles. I'm a Google developer expert on web extensions. I run a software as a service platform that's primarily extension-based. I have a Substack where I talk about extensions quite a bit. And my work background includes Google and DoorDash. So my entrance into this space was a little unusual because I have a pretty standard developer background. After I published the initial building browser extensions, I wrote an essay called "Let's Build a Chrome Extension That Steals Everything," where I discussed how exactly you would go about building an extension that steals absolutely everything your browser has to offer. And this was not a theoretical exercise. I actually built the extension that was able to steal everything. And I published this essay, and it was picked up very quickly in a lot of places. So it was #1 on Hacker News. I did an interview about it on the NBTV YouTube channel. So it was very clear that I hit a nerve. And a lot of people in the security space started reaching out to me. And so I was kind of thrust into this space. And so for this talk, if you take away nothing else, there's really two key points that I want to impress upon you. The first is that, as the title suggests, extensions are unreasonably effective tools for malicious actors. So what do I mean by unreasonably? So for what it goes into, publishing, creating, deploying an extension, they're very much a force multiplier, both for developers and for attackers. And at the same time, there is plenty you can do to defend against this extension. So knowing what they're capable of and knowing how they can reach your browser in perhaps unwanted ways is a very good tool, or there's a very good tool set that you can use to defend your organization against them. So I've kind of broken this talk up into 4 pieces. So we're just going to do a quick crash course about what extensions actually are. We're going to kind of talk about adversarial analysis. So we're going to think about how an attacker might analyze different pieces of extensions and use it against you. We're going to talk about some real world case studies where we're going to go through some major breaches that have happened, including the Cyberhaven one very recently. And then finally, we're going to close with how to harden your enterprise infrastructure. So ways that you can go about posturing your organization to defend, especially against malicious extensions. So let's go ahead and get into the crash course. So the first off, extensions are just add-ons that are changing the behavior of your browser and websites. So they're not standalone software programs they integrate into your browser. They're written with the same web languages that you would use to build a website. So HTML, CSS, JavaScript, JSON, there's nothing fancy going on. And things they're capable of doing are they can read anything that's on a website. So this means the actual content that's in a page, the URL that you're on, or data that's associated with the page. So cookies, credentials, things like that. They're capable of modifying what the browser is doing. So opening new tabs, closing tabs, changing web traffic, things like that. And they control an isolated process in the background. So this takes the form of a service worker, which is a very standard piece of web tech, but it lives inside the browser, but it's totally controlled by the extension. And so I just have a couple examples here. So on the left, we have a screenshot of uBlock origin. So this is it detecting you're trying to navigate to a URL and it's able to intercept that. And on the right, we have a very popular screenshot of the Grammarly extension, which is adding a little widget into the page itself. So the next thing to know is that browser enforced restrictions on websites do not apply to extensions. So what do I mean by this? So there are lots of pieces of tech inside the browser that make sure that websites stay inside their own footprint. So same origin policy, cross-origin resource sharing, things like of this nature, keeping websites contained to make sure that there's no abuse or cross-pollination. Extensions can cut right through all of that given the proper permissions. So they don't play by the same rules as websites, even though they're built with the same tech. They can inject JavaScript and styling into the page. So this is able to manipulate a page however you want. They're called content scripts, and it's a very powerful way of controlling what's in a website and also reading it. And you can do all sorts of bad things like adding keyloggers, but plenty of benign extensions use them effectively as well. All network traffic is plain text. So this theme will be coming back again and again. So extensions can see everything that's in the browser. And I really, really do mean everything. So on the right here, I have a picture of all the places in a network request where an extension can reach in and see what's going on with any web request that's being sent from a web page. And at the same time, as I mentioned before, they can dive in and with proper permissions, see anything that's associated with the page. So I can go in and grab your cookies. I can go in and see what you have in local storage. I can go in and see where your web browsing history is. So the way that these things are accomplished is by using the Web Extensions API. So the Web Extensions API is standardized by browsers. So Firefox, Chrome, Opera, all the browsers standardize on this one API, and this is how extensions work. So you'll request access to a certain piece of the API. This gives you access to a certain superpower in the browser. And only extension code can access these APIs. So on the right here, we've got a screenshot of the documentation for the cookies.getAll function, which, as you might suspect, this will dump all the cookies associated with the given domain. And this is only available to extensions. And so this is just a dump of all the different APIs that you can request for extensions. Obviously, extensions will only request a subset of them, but they are plentiful in nature. The next thing to keep in mind is that the way that this API, or the way that extensions gain access to these APIs is via permissions. So I like to describe it as it's analogous to a mobile app. So you're declaring when you're publishing an extension package, these are the APIs that I want access to, and then that in turn the browser will parse that list and give the extension access to be able to access this information. So you request access to cookies, you request access to web traffic, things like that. And then the especially sensitive ones, the users have to explicitly grant access. So on the right here, we have a pop-up for an extension that's asking for especially sensitive permissions, right? So it's asking access to all these Google domains. That is, not all permissions will generate this pop-up, but especially sensitive ones will. Another thing to know is that the way that extensions arrive on your computer are from vendor-controlled extension marketplaces. So each browser has its own. So Chrome has the Chrome Web Store, Firefox has Firefox add-ons, Edge has add-ons, et cetera, et cetera. Because most browsers are Chromium-based, they typically all can install from the Chrome Web Store. So an extension published in the Chrome Web Store can be installed on about 80% of desktop traffic, and that's been pretty consistent for the past year. So it's very much a monoculture for extensions. And one very, very important aspect is that once an extension is on your computer, or on your browser, I should say, the browser, at least the Chromium ones, but they all essentially function the same, will repeatedly phone home to the marketplace to check for updates. And these updates are automatically installed silently, and there's no way to opt out of them. So this is a very effective way of keeping extensions up to date, but also it can be used for nefarious purposes. And another thing to keep in mind about these marketplaces is that they're unverified. Publisher identities are very nebulous. So on the bottom here, I went onto the Chrome Web Store and I found an extension with 1 million installs, Web Chat GPT. Who knows what this does? There's really no information about who this developer is. You click through the website, there's really nothing on them. There's an email to contact them. That's about it. And there's 1 million people running this extension. So maybe it's fine, maybe it's not. We don't really know. And the other thing is that you can build a reputation based on fake reviews. So this is a post that I did last year where I built an extension that doesn't do anything, and then I spent like $50 in Bitcoin to buy some fake reviews, and sure enough, it was populated by all these reviews saying how great the extension is. So there's really the marketplace. Yeah, the marketplaces are pretty low trust environment.
All right.
So I think, go ahead.
No, I was just about to say that this was a great breakdown of how extension works. This is really helpful to set the stage. Now, while we see that they can be incredibly useful, they can also come with different security risks. You just started touching upon these when you talked about the store and some of the things that you did. So I think it's a good time to speak a little bit about biggest threats organizations should be aware of when it comes to adopting browser extensions, what permissions they should be most concerned about, what common security risks are posed by browser extensions in an enterprise environment. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so we'll touch on this in later sections, but I think the way that permissions are divided up it's really bucketed into 2 pieces. So there's permissions for the browser APIs, which cookies, web traffic, things like that. And then there's what's called host permissions, which is basically where these permissions are applicable. And so it's a very common pattern to see in malicious extensions that the bad ones are targeting very important domains. So you'll see, we'll talk about a research paper later, but overwhelmingly, when you're targeting like Google domains, when you're targeting Facebook domains, these are if it's targeting these domains, it's really, you should really raise an eyebrow at these things. In terms of just the general permissions, I mean, anything that's looking at web traffic, anything that can analyze all your traffic, these are very high security risks. Now, it's important to mention that benign extensions can use these too, right? If I'm an ad blocker, I necessarily need to run everywhere. So this shouldn't just be thrown out entirely, but probably extensions that are paying attention to sensitive domains and are watching your network traffic can be some of the most dangerous out there, especially at the scale of or enterprise organizations.
Thank you for that.
All right. So in this section, I call it adversarial analysis. So we're going to analyze topics about extensions from 2 perspectives. The first is from what it's like for a developer, and then we're going to view it from the perspective of the attacker. So the first one is browsers are checking for extension updates and installing them automatically. So if I'm a developer, awesome, right? I can be assured that updates that I publish are going to get pushed out quickly. I don't have to worry about versioning. Talking to the individual browsers, it's all going to get pushed out automatically. They're pushed out quickly. So if I publish a patch, it's going to get, for my own company, I start seeing people get an update within like 5 minutes. Great. And the users don't know any of this is happening. So I can silently push up patches. Fantastic. From the perspective of the attacker, if I'm able to get a malicious update out, I know that the entire user base is going to get it very, very quickly. And I know that the users really have no way to prevent this malicious update from reaching them other than uninstalling the extension entirely. And the users have no idea that this is happening. So this is fantastic from the attacker's perspective. The next one is browsers API are providing highly privileged access. This shouldn't be a surprise, as I mentioned before. If you're an ad blocker, you need powerful permissions to be able to block ads. And I know that when I'm requesting sensitive permissions, I know that the users are saying, yep, that's okay, right? They're explicitly granting access. But if I'm an attacker, I know that if I have enough permissions, the whole browser is basically plain text. I can see everything. I can read everything. It's all accessible to me with the right permissions. And I know that if I'm able to compromise a powerful extension, I get those permissions. So if I'm able to, corrupt the software supply chain. If I'm able to purchase an extension with sensitive permissions, I get those sensitive permissions and I can do whatever I want with them. The next one we'll talk about is extensions, or browsers can be configured to force extension installation. We can set enterprise policies to control how extensions reach the browser or preventing which ones. So this is great from an enterprise perspective. So I can say, yeah, everyone in the organization is running a Chrome browser. I can say we're using this extension. Everyone's getting it. Fantastic. I don't have to worry about rollout. The Chrome browser will take care of it all by itself. And then, if you need to sideload an extension, it's, all these extension companies are using it for testing tools. It's really useful. But if I'm an attacker, I know that I can, if I corrupt like the registry on a computer, I can force an extension, or I can force the browser to install my malicious browser extension. Or if I'm able to, change the launch command of Chrome, I can force Chrome to automatically sideload my malicious extension. And we're going to actually see this in a real world example later on. Extensions have unrestricted network access. As I mentioned before, I call it's plain text, right? I can see everything going in and out. Privacy extensions, ad blockers, password managers, they need to do this, right? When you're if you're using Bitwarden to be able to grab your password as you're submitting them, it needs to see the network traffic, and this can be accomplished safely, right? If it's a benign extension, all the status stays inside the browser and is totally safe. And if you're sending network requests from the extension, the background service worker, I know that it's protected from malicious websites. So I know that if I'm building a benign extension, I can talk to my server, I can, hold credentials. This is a safe place to hold it because I know that other websites and other extensions can't reach their fingers in. But if I'm an attacker, I know that I can silently sniff all activity, all network traffic. I can do it totally silently. It's a silent sentinel just watching everything that's going on. And if I'm building an extension that needs to talk to a C2, I can do it in the background script. And it's very hard to detect an extension talking to a C2 from the background. The next one we're going to talk about, it's extensions are install once, use anywhere. So what do I mean? So it's the Chrome Web Store says extensions should be single use. And a lot of these are really generic to like web browsing. So, hover over an image to zoom on it, PDF tools, really broad stuff that works anywhere and kind of generally enhances the web browsing experience. And these extensions accumulate huge user bases, millions of users. And then, privacy protecting ones, uBlock Origin, Bitwarden, but other ones like adding dark mode to the web. Dark Reader has millions of users. These are broadly popular and lots of people in lots of places install them. Attackers know this, and so these general use extensions are incredibly valuable because they appear everywhere. So they're people that are on sensitive networks. They might have these, they might have this dark mode extension installed. If you're able to compromise that extension, you have a foothold into that network. And the other thing is that extensions that are broadly used have overlap with broadly used services. So if you have a lot of people using an extension, a lot of those people have Facebook, and therefore a lot of those people have Facebook cookies that you can then access. So broadly installed extensions, we see time and time again, are extremely valuable targets, both for acquisition and for compromise. And some examples we'll kind of touch on later are HoverZoom and PDF Toolbox.
All right. Okay, so thanks for this analysis. This is great, and I think you're going to talk about some real life examples, which would be really interesting to hear about. Can you talk a little bit as part of this of why doesn't Google? I think you touched the fact that kind of a low trust, the low trust of the extension store. Can you also talk about why the review process of these stores does not catch malicious extensions? Why doesn't it get covered as part of it?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I think there's a lot of different angles to it. One is that, as we'll see in some of these case studies, the attackers work very, very hard to conceal the malicious extensions. So, there's lots of automated analysis that goes through, but I think that is fundamentally limited, especially at the scale that the web store operates. So it's a hard problem to catch malicious code, especially when the code is trying so hard to not be detected. Mm-hmm. And the malicious behavior, right? That's just this umbrella term that covers a lot of different things. So what does that mean? Is this like stealing your bank information, or is this just like keeping an eye on like what sites you're visiting? So I think it's not an excuse to not catch these updates by any means. I think it is an exceptionally difficult problem to catch it ahead of time. And so I think that the standard they set is that the marketplaces would prefer to empower the developers to maintain their business and platforms efficiently, rather than completely bog them down with really slow review queues where they comb through the code and maybe wouldn't find anything anyway. So unfortunately, the standard that it's come to, and it seems to be the status quo, and I really don't see it changing, is the stores, they do what they can to head off the kind of low effort, abuses where it's like, it's obviously going to steal everything, but attackers who really want to hide what they're doing and are, put in, use all the tools to hide, traditional detection methods, they're going to make it through, and then security researchers or users have to find out, unfortunately, and then those will be pulled after the fact. And this has been the status quo for some time, and I really don't see it changing.
Okay.
So in this section, we're going to go through some real world case studies. So I've picked out 4 particularly nasty ones that I think covered interesting aspects of extension abuse. But in general, the exploits are growing in frequency, sophistication, and scale. And so I threw together this timeline of some better known extension exploits. This is by no means exhaustive. This is kind of just what I could neatly fit on the slide. But there were plenty more. And additionally, lots of lower scale ones. So it is a real and pervasive problem that extensions are getting acquired by bad actors all the time. And extensions can be a relatively low trust software platform in certain conditions, but it's a problem, and it's a growing problem. So you'll see some commonalities in like kind of how these attacks unfold. And so I just wanted to give a high level overview. So obviously the first step is the infiltration. So how do we get the malicious code or the malicious extension on a computer? So some of it might be a Trojan horse extension, right? Seems like it's benign. Later, perhaps it turns, it's compromised by an attacker, or perhaps it was just, it had a latent malicious payload. As I mentioned, acquisition, there's a big market for buying popular extensions to turn them into, the bad actors will turn them into malicious extensions from benign. Sideloading is definitely a recurring problem. So if you're able to control the host system, you can configure Chrome to basically make an extension uninstallable. And once it is installed, extensions take care to remain installed. So you can alter the system configuration so that you're writing in the system registry to make sure an extension is like required to be installed with a browser, or we're modifying the Chrome launch script to sideload an extension. Or we're making sure to architect the extension so that it's avoiding traditional detection patterns, right? So we're not sending out malicious C2 traffic right away. We're going to wait a couple of weeks, or we're going to disguise what we're sending, how we're sending it, what we're collecting, keeping it low profile. So with the compromised extension, right now we got to make sure we have all the permissions we need to do all the bad activity. So things I've already touched upon: network traffic, browsing history, cookies, anything we want to abuse, steal, whatever it is. We got to make sure that these are provisioned for the extension. And then finally, now that we have everything and we're in place, we can do all the bad stuff, right? So ad affiliate fraud, we're hijacking people's Facebook ad accounts, data harvesting, we're taking all your browsing history in real time, credential theft, we're stealing cookies. We can, any site you're logged into, we can, spoof traffic to it, things like that. So the first one that we're going to talk about, which and is also happens to be the most recent one, is the Cyberhaven incident. And so the the Cyberhaven incident, unfortunately, is actually it's not just the Cyberhaven company. It's a class of extensions that were all compromised by a very effective phishing attempt. So a developer working that controls the extensions got an email that looked like from the Chrome Web Store, said you need to take some action, and ultimately directed them to install the privacy policy extension. And then they ultimately ended up granting OAuth permission. So a developer at Cyberhaven did this and gave the permission to the extension. And ultimately that meant that the bad actor controlling the privacy policy extension was able to directly push updates to the Cyberhaven Chrome extension, which was installed by lots of companies who were paying Cyberhaven to maintain their software. And so Cyberhaven self-detected this threat on Christmas, and it was pretty dire. So 35 total extensions ended up suffering this pattern of attack. Total user base was 2.6 million installs compromised, and the malicious payload took Facebook access tokens, PII cookies, and stole user agent data. And so this is just a list of all the extensions that were compromised that we know of so far, and the list may continue to grow. So the flow of this, it's a pretty standard phishing flow. So it's one of the simpler ones. So for these flow diagrams, I've boxed in orange the points where the attack could have been headed off, but a mistake was made. But yeah, the flow for the Cyberhaven incident was pretty standard. A phishing email campaign, they click it, they installed and gave permissions to the extension. It's possible to publish to these marketplaces via an API. So that's ultimately what they did. And as we'll see for basically all these, the marketplace is not detecting the malicious updates. It gets approved, auto updated by all the extensions, and then it's off to the races. So stealing PII credentials, things like that. So I guess for the Cyberhaven attack, a couple of key takeaways to note. All it took was one for each developer account. So this obviously was a single point of failure is always a terrible thing, especially when this means that you can propagate to your entire user base a malicious extension. You can read in the after action report from Cyberhaven, they've taken a lot of steps that probably they should have beforehand to prevent this from happening again. But as we'll see for again and again, the marketplaces are not good at detecting malicious updates. And one interesting thing is that, and again, to compare to mobile apps, the marketplaces are automatically signing extension packages. So this attack might not have worked when dealing with a mobile app because there's local credentials. There's an extra step to pushing an update, whereas for the marketplaces, you're essentially uploading a zip file, and then they say, good to go, pass the update, let's push it out. And one other tidbit for this attack is that ultimately the developer account was identified because their email was listed on the marketplace page. So the attacker just looked at the extension page, said, "Oh, that's the email I got to send it to." Done. That's all it took. So a brilliantly simple attack, and devastatingly effective. So next one we're going to talk about is ChromeLoader. So this attack is particularly interesting because extension is only a piece of the attack vector, and we're going to focus on that piece. It's the attack flow is much broader, but how extensions fit into it is a really interesting discussion. So this one was back in 2022. So the initial compromise is a pretty standard flow. So you trick a user into installing an executable. The way this was done varied by operating system, but you get them to download a disk image, mount the image, run the executable. That was the initial flow. So something that's been seen time and time again there. And this one was found by security researchers. So looking at the infection vectors, looking at Windows systems, they noticed there was a recurring PowerShell script that was configuring the locally installed Chrome to sideload an extension, which we're going to see the command line flag in a second. But the way that this was happening was the side loading is a particularly devastating way of installing an extension on a computer, because now we've kind of jumped outside the browser where we're puppeting the browser into kind of locking the malicious extension onto the system. So in July 2024, this was the #1 threat on Red Canary. And ultimately, the extension payload, we can see on the right here on the bottom, it asks for a huge list of permissions, and then it used those to inject adware or inject ads, and steal search data. And so the flow for this is greatly simplified, but I'm scoping it to how it's relevant to extensions. So as I mentioned before, they trick the user into clicking a URL and downloading a disk image. Ultimately, that lands into them running an executable. The executable did a number of things on the host system, one of which was to download code for a malicious browser extension, and then to configure Chrome to sideload that extension. And then it's talking to C2. One important thing to note is that the active side loading it via the command line flag, which we see here, this completely circumvents all the permission prompts. So a sideload extension can request whatever permissions it wants, and the user is not going to get notified. Just a couple of key takeaways from ChromeLoader. We've essentially, since we've compromised the host system, we've made this extension uninstallable. As I mentioned, the sideloaded extensions are sidestepping the alert message that the user might know that the extension is requesting as much as it has. And this extension, or this malicious extension, is able to hide a lot of the malicious behavior inside the browser, because I mentioned, right, this is all hosted first-party vendor-supported APIs happening within the context of a Chrome process. The next one we'll talk about is PDF Toolbox. So this one is, as Cyberhaven, this is actually scoped to a much larger set of extensions than just PDF Toolbox. It just happens that PDF Toolbox was the first one that was discovered. So this extension was just a collection of PDF utilities. Didn't seem to be anything bad, but a security researcher noticed that this extension was talking to a C2 server, and so they dug into it a little bit more. And noticed and ultimately unpacked like 34 extensions that were doing had a similar pattern. At least 34 extensions were compromised. This one was particularly bad. There was about 87 million people affected by this. So it was there were some big extensions in that list. And then the extensions, as usual, injecting ads, collecting data. This one's interesting because this one features remote code execution. And this is, we'll come back to that in a second. This is just a list of some of those 34 extensions. So the PDF Toolbox, the flow was, it started with either a legitimate extension that was acquired and then compromised, or published as a Trojan horse pretending to be a benign extension that did a real extension feature, but ultimately was just was lying in wait. This class of attack, the attacker was able to add a interpreter where the C2 server could actually send commands to access the web extension APIs, and do custom commands, which the Chrome spec is supposed to prevent this, but it is possible to configure the extensions, which all 34 of these did, where you're essentially allowing remote code execution from a C2 server, which is obviously incredibly dangerous. And again, the marketplace review didn't detect the update, and ultimately the attack was able to flow through to the users. RCE was used to serve ads and steal data. So just a couple of takeaways from this. Obviously, this attack, if it works in one extension, it can work in a whole bunch of extensions. So 34 in this case. This attack used very sophisticated code obfuscation, and it was able to evade the manifest v3 is the spec that controls extensions. It was able to evade this by by cleverly allowing the C2 to inject code. The last real world exploit we're going to talk about is Dataspii. So this one was back from 2019. It was quite a big deal at the time. Some users realized that they were using a platform called Nacho Analytics, and they realized that the data that they were sifting through was essentially being collected in real time and was way more privileged than it should have been. And then dug into it more and was able to find the extensions that were maliciously scooping up all this data from users unknowingly. So there were 8 total extensions compromised. And the big one with this one was that this penetrated major organizations, Fortune 500, Pentagon. We'll see in the next slide some of the data that was stolen, but major sensitive data was taken. So the flow for this one was very similar to PDF Toolbox in that it was started with a collection of seemingly legitimate extensions that were broadly installed. This one waited about 24 days to start collecting data. So, right, this was to evade detection very effectively. Collected PII browsing activity and sent it off to Nacho Analytics, and then Nacho Analytics sold that back to users. But lots of sensitive data was collected, including sensitive URLs, PII, things like that. So this is a very brief list of what was collected, but I mean, auth parameters, local network data from a healthcare provider, QuickBook invoices, tax returns, dangerous stuff. And I just to hit on this again, a sufficiently permissioned extension, the entire browser is plain text. So these were collecting secretly everything the users were visiting and looking at. It's all accessible to a malicious extension. And you might think that you would say, okay, well, this is wholesale data collection. You would think that this would be detected at the network level. I think that this extension goes to prove that it's harder than you might think to detect data collection like this at the network level. Even all of this was able to export across all these organizations. They were very slow to detect it. So the extension sitting inside the browser is very effective at concealing, outbound traffic.
All right, let's continue rolling. Very interesting stuff, and it looks like, as we understand the risks even further with the examples you gave here, the big question is, how do organizations manage risks? Well, they want to allow this productivity, but they want to also minimize the risk of using extensions.
Yeah, it's a good question. Really, of course, it's always a balancing act. And of course, it's always about layering security. But I think really deciding, right. So one aspect of it is deciding how much risk you're willing to take on. And I'm sure for a lot of companies, that's very little. But I think the key thing to focus on is even allowing a very restricted number of extensions, you're still not necessarily protected, right? Cyberhaven is the perfect incident, right? This was a trusted extension, and there are companies that were affected by this that they had, enterprise policies, they had protection from this, but because this was a trusted extension that they had whitelisted, that caught right through that. So your policy, your security posture as an organization should be a mix of prevention and detection. And I think that thematically should flow through your entire preparation for malicious extensions. But that's a great question, because we're gonna jump on that in this section. So we're gonna talk about hardening enterprise infrastructure. So I thought start off, let's talk about things not to do. So the first is, don't block all extensions. I say this every time I talk in a podcast, but perhaps I'm biased because I'm a web extensions GDE, but they're a cornerstone of browser security, right? Ad blockers, password managers, corporate security extensions, these improve security. So no extensions is strictly worse. Don't rely on marketplaces to save you, because they're not. We've seen this. I work directly with the Chrome DevRel team, and they work very hard to protect security, but it is definitely a losing battle from their part. And so I think that the onus of responsibility lies on the user and the organization surrounding that user to make sure that your browsers stay safe. And extension security is not a static thing, right? So as we've seen, a trustworthy extension could always become untrustworthy later on. And that's something to always keep in mind. So you can't just sit on your laurels and say, well, it's fine now, it'll be fine forever. That's obviously not the case. So one very important aspect of managing your browser extensions is to consider the permissions. So monitor active permissions. So look at what extensions your users have installed, see the permissions that they're requesting, make sure that they're trustworthy, that they're not over requesting permissions, that this extension looks like it's supposed to be doing what it's doing. And anything that's over requesting should be definitely flagged. And there are plenty of tools that allow you to do this. So in this slide, some researchers at Stanford published a paper last year that talked about malicious extensions. And I picked out this graph explicitly because I think it's so interesting. So they did an analysis of all the packages on the Chrome Web Store and flagged ones that were malware, benign, things like that, and looked at how many permissions they were requesting. And the malicious extensions stick out like a sore thumb. So most extensions know that they need to over request ahead of time or acquire an extension that has broad permissions. But it is very clear that over requesting permissions and requesting sensitive permissions is a very clear sign that you should take a closer look at an extension. The next one is to make sure and set your enterprise extension policy. So I'm going to scope this to Chrome, but this is true for lots of organizations, that you can set what extensions your users can install, must install, cannot install, and also sensitive permissions that you do or do not want to allow. And these all should be informed by a risk-based approach. So, I prefer to restrict and relax later, and always be monitoring. So unauthorized extensions, side loading, you should have systems in place that are monitoring for these patterns, because they're strongly correlated with malicious behavior in a lot of situations. And then of course, extensions are, I run an extension business. I know how much it can help businesses along. Make sure there's a robust exception process, because there can be extensions that are benign and will help your business. Something to always keep in mind is monitoring network activity. So you may have noticed a pattern as we talk through the real world extensions. Network activity is how almost all these were discovered, right? They're talking to the C2 servers. They're reaching out to these untrusted and suspicious domains. This is a major point that, right, the data can't be exfiltrated unless the extension is talking to a C2 server, and you need to be monitoring for this activity on your network. It's very, very standard security practices are going to get you a long way here, but something to keep in mind, if it's just passive monitoring that's flagging things, if you're catching the extension talking to the C2 server, it may have been too late. So this is very much from the detection side, but if you're seeing it on your network and it's not being hit by the firewall or it's not being blocked, the compromise may have happened, especially if we're talking about credentials. No surprise here, make sure and monitor and audit all the extensions that you have installed. Right, Cyberhaven is a big one, because this was a benign extension that was compromised upstream. So something that was, ostensibly protecting these companies ended up being malicious. And then, as we've seen through a couple of these attack patterns, latent malicious behavior is an effective way at hiding. So waiting a couple of weeks, C2 activation, things like that. This is also a big way of evading the Chrome Web Store, right? Their automated processes will install an extension, look for network activity that's suspicious. If it doesn't see any, then that's part of the approval process, and bad actors know this. And so we'll close off by just saying that dynamic threats demand dynamic posture. So what I mean by this is that to address malicious extensions, you need to know the limits of what your existing systems can and cannot do. So this means that, if you have something that's monitoring the host system, the extension is living inside Chrome. That is a very effective way of avoiding detection in ways that might otherwise be detected. So things that are, living inside Chrome is a great way to hide. And then the other thing is that any platforms you might adopt getting at inside the browser itself is absolutely essential. So there's a lot of companies on this slide. They're all adopting the same strategy of getting inside the browser or replacing the browser itself, but getting that proximity to your extensions, being able to monitor them, being able to manage them directly is a critical part of this. And then as we've seen in this recommendation section, balance prevention and detection, right? So managing permissions, this is prevention, right? This is making sure that extensions that you are not installing are able to do or not do the things you need them to do. And in the case that where you do become compromised, you're able to detect it quickly and shut it down. And I've thrown this graphic on the bottom. So there's kind of this spectrum where on one end we have these companies which are lightweight agentless that are an extension themselves and are able to very effectively kind of wrap themselves around other extensions, see what they're doing, kind of monitor what's going on. On the other end of the spectrum is browser replacement. So these are Chromium browsers that are going to replace Chrome itself and are able to kind of wrap themselves into the browser process itself and thereby manage any potential malicious extensions. And then Seraphic kind of lies in the middle. So they have this interesting integration where they lie inside the browser but aren't actually replacing it. But all of these are definitely better than nothing and are a crucial process of your enterprise security posture. So that's all with that. I think we're going to wrap up with a Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thank you. This was incredibly insightful, and thank you for going through this. And let's open it up for questions. Let's start with a quick one. Does Manifest version 3 change anything in profile of attacks or risk associated with extensions? There's some talk around the change of Manifest.
So the idea behind Manifest v3, MV3, it was supposed to close down a lot of security holes, and it did to a certain extent. But the threats that persist for enterprises haven't really gone away. It's the things that Manifest v3 closed down where you can't bring outside code into the extension. The way that network requests are intercepted was fundamentally changed, and so this did close some security loopholes. But I think it's abundantly clear in this presentation that the threats of an extension becoming compromised, Manifest v3 didn't really do anything to address these problems, because really this is a problem of all the APIs that can be abused are still there, and Manifest v3 did very little to shake that down. So yeah,
thank you. How can we not talk about AI these days? So do you think AI and automation will play a role in better security, better securing extensions, or addressing in the future?
100%. So I think one of the most promising avenues of AI is for code analysis. So and I know that Google is deploying this. I know that companies like Seraphic are deploying this, but AI is increasingly capable of de-obfuscating code, which is an incredibly important aspect of how extensions are analyzed to be malicious versus non-malicious. And the bad actors are, code obfuscation is an incredibly effective tool, as we've seen in this presentation. And AI is, I'm very excited to say that it's probably the most promising avenue going forward of combating against this.
Excellent. So I think that brings us to the end of today's session. We have a few more questions left, but we will address them offline as we don't have enough time. I do want to thank you again, Matt, for sharing all your expertise, and all of the audience here for joining us. I hope this discussion gave you some valuable insights into the risk of browser extensions and how to better secure enterprise environment. At Seraphic, we specialize in a security enterprise browser, including managing browser extension in a way that balances the security with usability, as we just discussed. If you'd like to learn more about how Seraphic can help, or if you're interested in seeing a demo, feel free to reach out to us throughout the website or connect with us over LinkedIn. And with that, I'll thank again for everyone for being here. And we look forward to continuing the conversation. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks, Matt, again. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you. This was fun.
Thanks a lot.